I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, ongoing discussion of the op-ed piece written by Marwan Barghouti, in which he castigated Israel for the way he claims Israel mistreats Palestinians in Israeli prisons and for Israel's continuing colonialist military apartheid occupation of the West Bank. The op-ed piece was published in the New York Times, which has since apologized for not notifying its readers that the author is a convicted murderer of Israeli civilians and is serving 5 life sentences. Barghouti is also the man who organized the first and second intifadas, which took the lives of over 1,000 Israelis. Well, how have the Israeli people responded to this op-ed? To give us an idea of the Israeli perspective, I'm so pleased to have on our JBS phones once again from Jerusalem one of Israel's foremost journalists, senior analyst at the Times of Israel, Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv, it is wonderful to be speaking with you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, Haviv, has there been, in your view, any consensus reaction in Israel to the publication of Marwan Barghouti's scathing criticism of Israeli treatment of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons and of Israel's apartheid occupation of the West Bank?
Yeah, I mean, when you get down to details, then you have a lot of diverging opinions in Israel about the nature of the occupation, about what happens going forward, whether there could be a peace with the Palestinians, what that peace looks like. But on the simple question of Marwan Barghouti getting to write an op-ed from inside an Israeli prison that doesn't mention in any place that he is convicted in a civil court. This is not a military court in the West Bank, which you know a lot of Palestinian prisoners go through a military court system, similar to what America has done, but on a bit of a larger scale with terrorists abroad. In Marwan Barghouti was convicted in an Israeli civil court under Israeli civil law with civil evidence. And everything you can imagine, and he was convicted of murdering many people and masterminding the murders of many people. He is the founder of the Tanzim militia inside Fatah, which was a militia that went around just murdering people in the streets in the Second Intifada, incidentally Palestinians. They opened fire on Palestinian protesters against Yasser Arafat, and he's one of the founders of Hamas's Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which is just simply a terror organization responsible for the deaths of Israelis, but not just Israelis. And this man, who is serving 5 life sentences plus another few decades in his sentences for actually committing murders and masterminding murders and hiring people to commit murders and the whole business. That's not, the fact that isn't mentioned in this op-ed, which takes Israel, to the cleaners about conditions of Palestinian prisoners, etc., is something that all Israelis really got behind. If you're on the left in Israel and you want a Palestinian state and you're worried about the occupation, this is terribly embarrassing that your purported, allies, abroad, the New York Times and such, would suddenly lionize this man, this mass murderer. He is a mass murderer. There's no standard that we can set by which he's not a mass murderer. And again, this is evidence that it was upheld in a civilian court. So, universal. You heard the Labour Party leaders, you heard Likud leaders, obviously, and farther to the right. Everyone came out against this and said this was a shameful thing for the New York Times, and really just embarrassing. And do they support this man, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And this comes from people who back a Fatah-led Palestinian state.
Yes.
Even that camp in Israel is horrified at the New York Times at what they did.
Okay. It's very important that you had a chance to say this to our audience. Incidentally, if the Times had written sort of an intro, and again, the Times has apologized for not doing this, but if the Times had put some intro in explaining who Barghouti was, would Israelis have any objection to the Times then printing an op-ed piece by him?
Yeah, I think there would be a kind of objection. Certainly for the Israeli right, there would be an objection. He's a terrorist, and why are you printing his opinions? But But I think there would be a sense, certainly in Israel, that there's a much more, Barghouti's voice is relevant. It's not that Barghouti doesn't have a relevant voice. In the sense that you do have to interview Assad and get a handle on what Bashar Assad is thinking. That is legitimate journalism, and it is not glorifying Assad, the mass murderer of hundreds of thousands of Syrian civilians, to interview him and allow him to express what he sees, how he sees the world. I don't think that bad people can't be interviewed. I don't think Israelis believe that. On Israeli national news, Channel 2, our most popular primetime television news channel, regularly Palestinian affairs reporters interview terrorists in Israeli prisons or go into refugee camps in some of the poorest parts of the West Bank, the real slums, and interview people who have had convictions of, etc. I mean, Israelis do see and receive, interviews with people they consider enemies. That's legitimate journalism. The complaint here is not that he got to express himself. I think the Washington Post ran the op-ed by the Unabomber. That was very controversial in America, but it happened, and there's a good argument that it's legitimate journalism. With even if the people you're doing it, whose voice you're expressing are bad people. But here's something else completely different happened. Incidentally, you say they apologized. I think they added, some sort of a correction. They added a little bit at the end that says he's actually sitting in an Israeli prison, convicted of murder or terror charges, but he didn't defend himself and claims the Israeli court has no jurisdiction or legitimacy. It was one of those kinds. I don't think, and you might know this better because I read this on the New York Times, maybe description of it. I don't think they actually apologized. And I think that even when they came in and gave some of this background, it was very much Barghouti's side of the background.
Yes, that's true.
Which is to say, to me, this is shocking. The standards of evidence and sentencing in Israel is much less severe than in the United States. We have much fewer percentage of people incarcerated, much higher burden of evidence for incarcerating people in civil courts, and prison sentences that automatically, if for good behavior, you get a third off your sentence. If you get 20 years in an Israeli prison, that's automatically 14 years. And then you have to do something terrible to lose, to actually serve the 20. It's an incredibly lenient justice system. We have one of the more lenient civil justice systems in the world. And Barghouti in this justice system has 5 life sentences plus 40 years. So it's just I don't think even now the New York Times has really given what we saw a very serious criticism of the New York Times from its public editor. But I don't think we've seen from the editors of the actual op-ed pages, the people who are making these decisions, any kind of mea culpa, any kind of serious sort of grounding of who this man is. Incidentally, there was no background on the fact that he is engaged now, Barghouti, in this winner-takes-all political battle against Abbas. That this hunger strike that he announced in this op-ed is in fact a gambit for taking over the PA. There's so much important background here that was really left out, and the New York Times was used by this man and allowed itself to be used in a way that whitewashed one of the major criminals, one of the major terrorists and killers of Israelis in the last 5 decades.
Again, I think it's so important for you to say this. Look, many American Jews, let alone Americans in general, American Jews read that piece, and in many ways it was very upsetting to think that Israel could be acting this way, even against terrorists. And one of the things that we hear all the time is the extent to which Israel is in some way a model for what we want societies to be when they deal with people who blow other people up. And, we talk about all the time how Israel has this practice that if for somehow a suicide terrorist survives the attack, he's treated in the same hospital in the next room with those who have been victims. And there's something laudable about that. Now we read Barghouti's piece, and the thing that stays with everyone is his describing how he was kicked so hard in the genitals he passed out, and the way he draws it for an American who has not experienced the system, who doesn't know the system, it makes it sound like Israel is less than what you want Israel to be. So for you to be able to come on, and I hear the passion with which you speak, and it's not about, it doesn't reflect anything about the peace process. It reflects, I believe, how you feel a story that was so one-sided. And really, Haviv, what you're saying is there was something dishonest about the way in which this story got played in the New York Times. Am I hearing you correctly?
I think so, and I think that the New York Times is still being dishonest. Now, when you're bringing up the content of his op-ed and the claims made in the op-ed, it's really important for me personally, as an Israeli, not to defend Israel. Mainly because I'm an Israeli. I have a lot of complaints,
Sure.
about my country.
Yep.
We have been engaged. We have had very serious, dramatic sort of watershed moments in this country's history of fighting against various kinds of terrorism that have included security services sort of massively overstepping what they're legally allowed to do, and Israel's own laws, and human rights, and then court cases and soldiers in prison for it, and procedures instituted, and all these kinds of. Just in the last 10 years, we've had a law passed that systematized and gave a legal framework for the Shin Bet Security Service and how it interrogates people and whether it tortures people. These questions of privileged evidence that a prosecutor can present to a court about a terrorist, but the defense can't see, so that the state doesn't give up its intelligence to the terrorist himself, right? Tremendous questions of criminal justice when it comes to terrorism has been at the forefront of the Israeli debate. I think Israel has occasionally failed. I think there has been abuse. I think we know that there has been abuse because we journalists have covered it and courts have ruled on it, and politicians have given speeches about it. The sort of everyone is always being tortured all the time, that's what Israel is argument that Barghouti tried to make,
yes,
is a complete fiction.
Yeah.
That is a complete fiction, and you know it's a complete fiction because Barghouti's strike in Israel, the actual strike that he has announced in Arabic and in Hebrew, and the things that he is demanding
yes,
from the Israel Prisons Authority to end his strike are prison conditions. Not end the torture, because he knows he'll be laughed out of the room, because there's High Court of Justice oversight over the prison service, and torture has to be approved by special committees. If there is used, and it can only be used on ticking clocks, people, ticking time bombs, people who are about to carry out, and it can only be used in ways that are very carefully and legally marked. So his actual demands are things like he wants security prisoners to be able to study for academic degrees during their prison service. That is a demand that they are making, the hunger strikers, an actual demand that they are making right now, the Israel Prison Service. They want, instead of one visitation period each month for family and friends and whatever, they want 2 visitation periods each month. They want a public telephone in every security ward in every prison where there are security prisoners who are in prison for terrorism-related offenses. They want a public telephone because there's huge restrictions. They can't have cell phones, and there are very serious restrictions on how they communicate and all this. So they want a public telephone available. These are the demands actually being made to the Israel Prison Service. There's no demand being made here on the ground, not in the New York Times where, it's sort of meant for foreigners to read and develop all kinds of ideas about. The actual demands in Israel are these very prosaic. They're not prosaic if you're the prisoner, obviously. These are very important things for the prisoner. But it's just, that's simply not the reality. That's
yes,
simply not. And with all, and left-wing activists would tell you what I'm telling you, who are deeply critical of the occupation and deeply critical of the imprisonment of some of these Palestinians are in prison under administrative detention, which is this counterterror measure where they don't get a full trial. There's a lot of problems. There's a war on terror, and we're having as many problems as you're having. You just had a president who for 8 years couldn't close Guantanamo Bay because it's actually not simple to deal with terrorism in sort of standard criminal justice ways. And we have all of those problems, and I'm very eager to hear people criticize Israel and try and hold Israel to account and to a higher standard. But Barghouti's op-ed presenting that as the reality and the only and the overwhelming and the constant reality is simply not true.
Mm-hmm. By the way, in terms of the actual substance of his piece, you point out that what the hunger strike is aimed at affecting is never mentioned in either the op-ed piece or anything that the Times writes. But when it talks about Israelis torturing Palestinians, when it talks about Israel purposely puts all of the prisons inside Israel to make it difficult for family members to visit Palestinian prisoners, that type of criticism, to what extent do Israelis feel they're valid? Whether
Well, I mean, it's just factually untrue. Google Ofer prison, one of the largest and most important security prisons Israel runs under the Israel Prison Service, in which senior Hamas operational people and terrorists of various kinds have been incarcerated, sometimes for years at a time. Ofer prison is over the Green Line, just south of Bitunia, which is like a suburb of Ramallah. I hope that guides people, and they'll find Ofer prison. A big Israeli security prison, not in Israel. By the definitions he uses. I'm not making political statements either way.
Exactly.
But it's not an op-ed meant to convey some kind of analytical reality.
Yes.
It's an op-ed written by an activist, a mass murderer, to push a political agenda that he's trying to push right now. By the way, he's not even writing it against Israel. He's pretending to write it against Israel because he's really writing it against Mahmoud Abbas. There is a massive battle. There was, in the last 6 months, the Fatah Central Committee had elections. Barghouti expected, and his followers and backers expected him to be appointed the deputy head of the Palestinian Authority. Mahmoud Abbas didn't appoint him deputy head of the Palestinian Authority, even though he's chairman of the Central Committee. I understand this is into the weeds in Chinese, but I'm just trying to give a little bit of a flavor of the real world in which Barghouti is maneuvering, and for which he really abused and used the New York Times. And they were, willing fools in this game. He is trying to show that he is still effective and important and resisting Israel as a bid for domestic political relevance inside Palestinian society. That's the deep background here.
That's fascinating. By the way, are you saying to me that Barghouti, who is serving the rest of his life in an Israeli prison, wants to have a formal position of leadership in the PA?
He asked. He demanded to be deputy chairman of the Palestinian Authority. He is, at this moment, the chairman of the Central Committee of the Fatah, which is the most senior institution inside the Fatah party, Mahmoud Abbas's party that runs the Palestinian Authority. A lot of people among Palestinians, but also I think among diplomats overseas who don't quite grasp how Israelis view this man and what he actually has done, talk about him as someone who can replace Abbas as the Palestinian leader. This is absolutely, he has political aspirations.
Haviv, it sounds ludicrous to me. And it's not like we don't know that there are sometimes political prisoners who actually operate out of prison. There are mafia leaders who operate out of prison. But for diplomats in other countries to even entertain the idea that Barghouti, who is going to spend the rest of his life in Israeli prison, is going to replace Mahmoud Abbas as an active president of the PA, that sounds ludicrous to me.
There are a couple of things to consider. One, Barghouti has a great deal of influence and public support in the Palestinian public. And the key reason for that is he's seen as a person who put it all on the line, who ran and managed and really sort of launched a war against Israel that had a profound effect on Israel. The Israelis really were, affected by this very powerful sort of the terror attacks and the waves of terror, et cetera. He is sitting now 15 years or so. I think he was arrested in 2002. He's sitting now for 15 years in an Israeli prison, which gives him, again, that sort of authenticity, that gravitas. This man is a symbol of the Palestinian struggle. And if you are trying to talk to a Palestinian public that has already voted in 2006 for Hamas, right? A majority of Palestinians wanted Hamas to run the place. Today in the West Bank, Hamas would win an election, probably, according to some polling that exists out there, some pretty good polling. And in Gaza, Fatah would win, which is to say the Palestinians, wherever they live, want the other party the party that isn't ruling them to rule them. The Palestinians are not crazy. But if you're looking at the Palestinian public and you see Fatah losing ground to Hamas, and you see this jailed leader who has this sort of gravitas of having really sent the Israelis running once upon a time, there's a lot of support there. And so you start to wonder, you a diplomat in Norway, or you some sort of progressive activist for the Palestinian cause, you might not like that he's a terrorist, that he murdered people, but you think that if you can get this guy to be a moderate, if this man can change his spots, he has support, and therefore he's a good Palestinian leader. Abbas, of course, is now in the 11th year of a 4-year term. He won't hold new elections because he would lose them, right? And so Abbas does not have public support. So the people who want Barghouti to replace Abbas, that's what they're thinking. They're thinking we need a legitimate leader who isn't Hamas. It's not a completely crazy argument. The problem with the argument is he's a mass murderer of Israelis. The Israeli public cannot stomach this man being released, this man running in his own country, this man having a state of Palestine. That's not something that can move inside Israeli politics. And so it really is, I think, a dead letter. It's not a good idea to pin hopes for peace on. But again, the New York Times didn't give any of that context either.
Exactly.
In other words, it really was a silly way to present what was a legitimate op-ed. Sitting down with Marwan Barghouti and allowing his voice to be heard is legitimate journalism.
I agree.
But not free of context, as if
I agree
it's just
100%.
Marwan Barghouti, the activist, or something like that.
Yes. By the way, I do want to clarify for our viewers, if they haven't heard already, Barghouti received ultimately his high school education, his college education, 2 advanced degrees, one a master's degree and one a PhD degree, while he was in Israeli prison, correct?
I don't know exactly the degrees, but yes.
Okay.
He has had higher education in Israeli prison. All Palestinian prisoners, including convicted terrorists, have access to higher education. Israeli prisons generally are seen by the Israeli state as rehabilitation institutions and not punishment institutions. And so there are prisoners in Israel, for example, unless you're in the maximum security prison and convicted of some terribly heinous crime, prisoners actually get to go home on weekends. So the Israeli prison system is a very different concept. And yes, Palestinians, including terrorists, get to pursue higher education. That was stopped because of really a public outcry and anger in the last few years. And one of the reasons that there's now a hunger strike, one of the demands of the strikers, is to bring that back for security prisoners.
Yes.
And that's I think, very interesting.
I
They
just want to
found
make
that
sure,
very important.
Right. I just want to make sure our audience understands. It's to bring something that was once a staple, and then for various reasons, some of which were quite good, Israel stopped the system. But I don't want people shouldn't miss the fact that Palestinians convicted of murder are given the opportunity to get high school, college, masters, and doctorates while still prisoners in Israeli prisons. The other thing that bothered me, when the Times did print at the bottom who he was, they used the word parliamentarian. Now, I understand he has been a part of the political system in the Palestinian world, but parliamentarian sounds as if he is a man committed to a democratic process similar to what we would see in the Parliament in Great Britain, and that he was therefore a political prisoner a la Nelson Mandela rather than a convicted murderer. And we're talking here about, as you say, 5 specific murders and then a spate of others. And for various reasons, the Israeli government, the Israeli judicial system didn't feel he could be punished for those specifically. How do you react to the fact that he's called a parliamentarian, and do you feel it mischaracterizes who he is?
That's a good question. When the New York Times corrects itself, that's not a common occurrence, and it's of course an emotionally intense one because they have concluded that either the public outcry is too much or they really did make a mistake, and therefore they have to correct. And these professional wordsmiths, these people whose job is carefully crafting text, then come to actually print a correction, to actually craft this correction, they're very, very careful about it. And so I think that it is completely legitimate that you are reading it very, very carefully, because they wrote it very carefully. And I agree with you that parliamentarian reflects technically his status as a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council. The Palestinian Legislative Council, of course, was elected in 2006 to a 4-year term, and it is now in its 11th year. In that sense, now he's been in an Israeli prison since 2002. He hasn't actually served as a parliamentarian for 1 minute.
Yes.
So in that sense, you can say he's a parliamentarian, sure. But it seems that's a very weak aspect of his biography compared to founder of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, founder of the Tanzim. One of the, probably the most powerful internal Fatah challenger to Abbas. The head of the Fatah Central Committee, a man who has all these life sentences convicted in a civilian court for murdering Israelis. Those seem like larger aspects of his biography than parliamentarian. And I would agree with you. I don't know from the inside. I didn't talk to anyone in the New York Times about this question. But it seems that is a way of saying that there is this sort of political element, and he is some kind of a political figure and a legitimate one. A parliamentarian is not a dictator, not a strongman, not the head of a militia, which is where he actually draws his domestic power. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes,
I would say that's absolutely true, and I would say that is the New York Times failing to do what you suggested earlier. It sounded like they apologized, and yet somehow they managed to not apologize.
You know, it makes it sound like, again, there was no mention that he was a murderer in the initial op-ed presentation. And then to put at the bottom of the page that he is a parliamentarian, it sounds as if Israel has jailed someone as a political prisoner, and that this is a legitimate, ongoing representative of the Palestinian people. Now, you've explained he has a very important role in the Palestinian world. But parliamentarian is not the appropriate expression to use to describe him. I have one.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to clarify. I wouldn't expect the New York Times to take Israel's side. In other words, I wouldn't want the New York Times to come out and say he's a terrible terrorist and we hate him, and here's what he thinks. Like, I don't want to read that in the New York Times. I think the New York Times doesn't owe us that, and I think it owes its readers better. But I would expect, you just put it in a way that I think is very appropriate. On the Israeli side, he is viewed as an architect of the mass waves of suicide bombings that murdered 1,500 Israelis 15 years ago. On the Palestinian side, he's one of the most popular leaders, including in Fatah, and one of the few people considered by many to be able to challenge Hamas in a free political contest. And therefore, some people pin their hopes on him, even though they understand that that description, where you say the Israelis think he's a mass murderer and the Palestinians think he's a bulwark against Hamas, that's fine, and then I can start arguing, this side's right, that side's wrong, or whatever, then we can have a debate. That would be legitimate journalism.
I have one more quick question for you. Abbas is about to come to Washington for the first time. He has made a statement that he is prepared to work under and with President Trump to see if they can restart the peace process, and that he's committed to a two-state solution in the framework of 1967 borders. Haviv, if Israelis were sure that the Palestinians were now willing to live with Israel the way Canada lives with the United States, that sure, with that model, what percentage do you believe of the Israeli people would be willing to give up the West Bank in such a two-state solution?
We have fantastic polling, hundreds of polls carried out by right-wingers and left-wingers and foreigners and think tanks and the U.S. government of Israeli public opinion on this question. And we know for a fact that Israelis want separation from the Palestinians, including a territorial withdrawal from the West Bank, if that's what's required. And they just don't think it's possible because they don't think it'll end the war. They think it'll escalate the war. We, at this moment, Israelis, believe, the majority of us, at least 70%, some polls put it higher, even above 80%, which in a democracy is a shocking majority. we believe that separating from the Palestinians is the best thing for us. And we believe that if we do pull out of the West Bank, it'll go the way of Gaza, and it will become more bloodshed and terrible war, and that's because we think that if we pull out, Hamas will take over. The fact that Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, hasn't held an election in 11 years is because Mahmoud Abbas thinks Hamas is going to take over. And that suggests to Israelis that they're not wrong in this concern. So if the Palestinians can deliver reconciliation, genuine reconciliation, actual peace, there is a majority among Israelis, including Jewish Israelis, including, by the way, there's a majority, some polls poll just right-wing voters. There are majorities in some right-wing voter bases for a withdrawal that includes peace. Israelis do not believe at this point, 25 years into the peace process, that a withdrawal would mean peace. And the fact that Barghouti is the most popular Fatah leader after Abbas is a good reason for that. And so I completely share what you're alluding to. That is the Israeli view. The Israeli view is that if the Palestinians can deliver peace, the Israelis want it. It's just the skepticism is overwhelming, including among the left. You won't meet left-wing Israelis who tell you that a withdrawal from the West Bank will bring peace. You will meet left-wing Israelis who at best will tell you a withdrawal from the West Bank will probably bring more war, but it's worth it to end the occupation because the occupation is destructive and morally destructive and financially destructive. It's worse than what those wars will be like. And by the way, some of these people making this argument are former generals, very serious Israelis who have devoted their lives to Israel's security. It's not a silly argument. They're very serious people making it. But just about nobody in the Israeli political debate is making the argument that at this moment, if we pull out, the Palestinians will reciprocate with peace. And that's the major problem within Israeli politics with pushing forward to a peace agreement.
You have said it so perfectly, framed it for us so perfectly. You are just wonderful. Haviv, Mazal Tov on the birth of your third son. And thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving us time. Your analysis was fabulous and very, very helpful to all of us. We will talk again very soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You be well. The thoughts of Haviv Rettig Gur, senior analyst at the Times of Israel. And boy, doesn't he put it just perfectly. And there is a mantra that every one of us should be saying over and over, no matter whom we are speaking with. When Israelis say they are against the two-state solution, they don't mean in principle. They mean now, under the present circumstances. As he says, when Marwan Barghouti would be the choice, when Mahmoud Abbas does not hold elections because he knows Hamas is going to win, and if Israel created a two-state solution today, went along with it, there would be Hamastan on the West Bank. In that circumstance, Israelis say we don't want to make peace with the Palestinians. But it's not in principle. And if at any point the Palestinian world would say with honesty, we'll be Canada living next to the USA, the majority, you heard Haviv, we're talking about 70, 85%, including a majority of settlers or right-wing people. Tomorrow, the Palestinians can have the West Bank, we'll help them build it, and we'll live in peace. But it's got to be an honest peace. So don't be fooled by people who say to you, oh, the Israelis are no longer in favor of a two-state solution. That's nonsense. The Israelis are in favor of a two-state solution. It just has to be honest. And they don't see any honest opportunity today, and the Palestinian has not given the Israeli any reason to see the situation any differently. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, program coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's associate director, Dara Golub, editors Dennis Golan and John McDevitt, and the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.